class is on the influence of Protestantism on the American Constitution. Now, you got to remember that this is the late 1700s. The Constitution was written between 1783, I believe was, but it wasn't ratified and it didn't go into effect until several years later. So we're talking about a period of time in America when there had not yet been Catholic immigration into the country. That came later. There was big waves of Irish immigration prior to the Civil War, and afterwards as well. So the country basically was Protestant. Everybody was Protestant. But there were several kinds of Protestants, okay? So, and the other thing that's really important to understand is that the colonies were not all founded for the same reason, okay? Some were founded for religious reasons, some were founded for economic reasons. So, for example, you all remember the Pilgrims, of course. The Pilgrims were Calvinists. They were Protestants of the Calvinist tradition. We'll talk about Calvin here in a minute. And they came to the coast of Massachusetts so that they could practice their faith without interference from the British Crown, okay, or from the Church of England. So, that they spread from there to the other New England colonies. So New England as a region was basically an area that was founded basically for the purpose of religious freedom. Okay, and founding the kind of society that they believed reflected the Bible and God's will. Okay, so they wanted to be the city on the hill, they used to call it. And so the New England colonies were founded on that basis. The southern colonies were not founded for the same reason. Okay, so Virginia is the best example. Virginia was founded for economic reasons. All right, investors invested in the colony of Virginia because Virginia has the kind of climate where you can grow tobacco. And tobacco was in wide demand back in those days. So investors believed that they could put their money into these tobacco plantations and then import the tobacco, not just to Britain, but throughout Europe, and make a lot of money, okay? So, and the same was true of the other southern colonies as well. They were founded for economic reasons. Because of the warm climate, for example, South Carolina is warm enough so that you can grow cotton. And cotton was in very high demand in those days. We're talking about the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. So there was manufacturing plants in England that would take the cotton that was grown in the South and turn it into cloth, from which people made clothing or carpets or anything that you can make cloth, anything that you can make out of cloth. All right, so for that reason, the religious affiliation of the people in Virginia to take that one as an example, was primarily Anglican. They remained identified with the Church of England. Okay, whereas in New England, they were fleeing the Church of England, and out of the people that immigrated into the New England colonies, several Protestant denominations were formed. Congregationalists, Church of Christ, Baptist. There were various denominations that came out of there. And then Pennsylvania is a whole different animal, okay? So William Penn was a what? You remember? He was a Quaker. He was a Quaker, all right? And the Quakers were not welcome where the Church of England had influence either, because they were considered heretics, okay? So, so William Penn, he decided he wanted to establish a colony that would welcome people from any religious group that felt as if they were persecuted in Europe. Okay, so as a whole, we call them Anabaptists because they believed in rebaptism. If you were baptized a Catholic, they didn't believe in Catholic baptism, so you had to be rebaptized. All right, and that is why Pennsylvania has a high population of the Amish, they were Anabaptists, Mennonites, and a lot of Lutherans came to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had a very heavy population of Lutherans. There were 2 seminaries established in Pennsylvania, Lutheran seminaries, one in Gettysburg, one in Philadelphia. So anyway, so while everyone was Protestant, they were not all the same kind of Protestants. However, there are certain Protestant principles, okay, that they all held in common. And those principles, that way of thinking, okay, for example, how does, this is a good way to put it, how did Thomas Jefferson open the Declaration of Independence? What did he say about human beings?
All are created equal.
All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. All right? That is Protestant, okay? It's Protestant in the sense that Protestants believed, based on the biblical material, such as we were created in the image of God in Genesis, right? So a society where you have classes of people, where some are far more important than others. You got everything from the impoverished to the very rich, to the royal family, the lords who had these big estates and all of that. To the people who came to this country, that looked unchristian, because people were not treated equally. Some were treated better than others. All right? So, that idea that all of us are created equal becomes one of the established ideas that is embedded in American culture from the very beginning. Okay? Now, if all men are, all human beings, all people, they use the word, just use the word men in the past, they meant all people. Yeah, they met. It was a patriarchal society. So, if all people are created equal, okay, and God has made us in God's own image, what does that imply with respect to how a person should be able to live their life? If you're equal to the next guy, and nobody is better than anybody else, what does that imply for the way for one of the values that we should hold dear to?
Equal opportunity.
Freedom. Freedom. That's why freedom becomes an American ideal, embedded in our culture. Okay, when people see the American flag, they think of it as a symbol of freedom. Okay, because that's just a part of the idea that all people are created equal, so they should be free to make their own choices, and that means that your conscience, nobody else should be able to have any control of your conscience. Okay, and your conscience includes your opinions, your beliefs about politics, your religious beliefs, whatever it is that you think is an important value, you should be free to express yourself. All right? So, where in the Constitution is that freedom guaranteed?
Bill of Rights.
Yes, and I'm thinking of one of them. Okay, the first one. The first one says that it prohibits government from interfering in religious expression. Okay? The government is forbidden because that's a matter of conscience. Okay? And people are free to choose because they're all equal. And so you should be able to be free to choose if you want to be a Quaker or a Mennonite or a Lutheran or whatever. Okay? You're free to choose. All right? So that becomes, and the other part of that particular amendment included freedom of expression. Okay? So some people take that to extremes, like we saw yesterday, and they block bridges, okay, and make it difficult. So there are limits to things. You got to have limits, or you're going to have chaos. But American citizens are guaranteed the freedom to assemble and give their opinion on whatever it is that their cause might be, so long as they get a permit from the local authorities to gather at a certain place and to express themselves. All right? That's also a part of that particular amendment. And then freedom of the press is in there as well. Okay? Because the press is where opinions are expressed and where ideas are shared. Okay. Now, I want to deal with the issue of slavery and the Constitution because here's the thing. When the people with the money invested in southern colonies, Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, whichever one you want to name, for the purpose of growing crops that were in high demand and that they could earn a big profit, okay, they needed labor in order to make this profitable, okay? Now, in the South, slavery became the method by which people could keep these products profitable, okay, cotton or tobacco or whatever it was, okay? So if you didn't have to pay laborers, your profits are going to be, in other words, if they didn't have slaves, they wouldn't have been able to do what they did. It wouldn't have been profitable enough. Now in the North, where the climate is different, okay, you can't have a big plantation in New Hampshire or Massachusetts or even New York. The northern colonies did not develop this same totally agrarian society. It was totally focused on agriculture. In the North, the Industrial Revolution was taking place. They were building factories. It was a completely different economy that was being developed in the northern colonies, okay? And in the northern colonies, they believed in paid labor, okay? So you hire people and you pay them for the labor that they give you in manufacturing whatever you manufacture. Now they were building factories up north, textile factories that could build things out of iron, all kinds of different kinds of things were developing up in the north. So if you've got a country, all right, on the Atlantic coast that goes all the way from Maine to Georgia, Florida wasn't included because Spain owned Florida at that time, okay? You've got a wide range of climate, okay? And you can produce things in the south that you can't in the north, all right? So the north develops an industrial economy, the south is an agrarian economy. And over time, and by the way, the south also develops a class system because there were the big plantation owners and there were the small farmers, okay? Now, most southern white people did not own slaves, but the big plantation owners owned sometimes over 100 slaves. The small farmers couldn't afford to buy a slave, okay? They were expensive. So, but because they were white, and because if you were to ask a Southerner, we live in a country based on the equality of all people, how can you possibly justify slavery? What do you think a Southerner would have said?
They weren't considered people.
Yeah, right.
They were considered an inferior race.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. They didn't believe that they could do what white people do. In fact, they went so far as to say they were better off
Yeah.
living on a plantation in South Carolina than over in New Guinea. Yeah. So, I mean, it was rank racism. All right, so so let's talk a little bit about what led up to the Constitutional Convention. Why did the colonies eventually decide to have a Constitutional Convention? All right. What year was the Declaration of Independence written? 1776. Okay, in 1776, because of a number of issues that had been going on between the colonies and Great Britain over several decades, the colonies decide to break all ties with Britain. Okay, what was the main issue that caused the colonies to decide to break off with Britain?
Taxation.
Taxation, but
Without representation.
there you go. They didn't have, there were no Americans in the British Parliament. And the British Parliament is the entity that passed tax laws. So the Americans weren't represented in the entity that taxed people. Okay, so they didn't believe it was just. It's not just to tax someone who doesn't have a say in the law that is being considered or passed. Okay, so this leads to a number of incidents. What's the most famous?
The Boston Tea Party.
The Boston Tea Party. Yeah, the Boston Tea Party. They dress up like Indians, right? And they throw all the tea into the Atlantic, and that was the end of that. Okay, so that causes the British to send their army over here because the colonists are getting too uppity, and they've got to they've got to try and get them under control, right? And a conflict breaks out again in Boston. Boston was the most radical city of all the cities in North America. A conflict broke out that started the war. You remember what that was? The Boston Massacre, exactly. There was a riot, okay? And the British soldiers felt threatened. So they pulled out their guns, and several people were killed. All right? Now, interesting little tidbit here. Do you know who represented those British soldiers when they were put on trial? John Adams. Yeah. John Adams represented them, and he got them off. He got them off. Okay. So anyway, and then there was, and after that there was the fight at Lexington and Concord, and finally the colonies decide, okay, we've got to have a continental convention, all right, to decide what we're going to do here, because the relationship with Great Britain isn't working anymore. These were people who highly valued, number one, their freedom, and number two, their independence, and number three, the idea that all people are equal in the eyes of God. Okay, these things were the values that drove them, all right? they were the values that shaped the culture, and that and the culture you grow up in is the culture that causes you to think the way you do, right? Okay, so if you grow up in if you grow up in India, are you going to think the same way as somebody who grows up in Brazil? No, it's a different culture. So different values, different ideas, different ways of understanding the world. All right. So these values I just mentioned are the values that shaped American culture at the time. Okay, and they're all Protestant values, and they come from Protestant theological ideas. All right, so delegates from each colony meet in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. How many of you have ever been there? Yeah? Okay. Fascinating place. They all meet there, and they argue about it for a while. Finally, they chose Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson to write a Declaration of Independence. Finally, they decided, okay, we're going to break all ties with Britain. All right, and Adams and Franklin said, we can't write as well as you, Jefferson. You write. So he wrote it. Then it was brought, and by the way, Jefferson included in the original Declaration of Independence, he included a clause that blamed Britain for introducing slave labor into North America, which he knew would eventually lead to major conflict in one way or another. Because you've got two different cultures forming in this country, an agrarian culture in the South and an industrial culture in the North. So really, at the time, it's not one country, it's two countries. Completely different way of thinking, living, completely different kind of economies. It was just like two countries rather than one. Okay, so between 1776 and when the Constitutional Convention was called in 1783, or 1786, one of the two. It's in the text. 1787, thank you. What is it that served as the document that governed the colonies? What governed the colonies before there was a constitution? It was primarily state government, yes. Articles of Confederation, okay. So what did the Articles of Confederation have in them? Number one, they gave the individual states all the power. Okay, there was no federal power of any consequence. Number two, there was no army. All right, if there was a conflict, and this was one reason George Washington had such a hard time winning the war. The only way you could raise an army was if the individual colonies would volunteer people from their colony to be in the army. So it was all based on each colony volunteering members to be in the army. Okay. Thirdly, the Articles of Confederation had no power of taxation. They couldn't tax anybody for anything. So when the army, I'm just using the army as an example to help you understand why the Articles of Confederation failed. When the army needed uniforms, shoes, guns, food to feed the soldiers, all of that, where did they get it? They didn't. That was the problem. Yeah. Okay, you remember the story of Valley Forge? That harsh winter in Valley Forge? The army almost completely disappeared. Everybody was deserting because they were in bare feet and it was 20 below zero and 2 feet of snow on the ground. All right? It was only because of their allegiance to George Washington that finally held it together. But, okay, so the Articles of Confederation failed because it didn't have an executive branch. There was no president. They couldn't tax. They couldn't raise an army. And there was no agency that governed trade. Okay, so each colony would make their own trade agreements. Well, eventually, that's not going to work. Okay, so at the end of the war, the country was so far in debt because they borrowed money from the Dutch and from the French. The country was so far in debt, and they couldn't pay it back because there was no entity that could collect taxes. Conflicts were breaking out. Okay, there was a whiskey rebellion in western Massachusetts. All right, Massachusetts put a tax on the production of whiskey. And the whiskey producers raised a ruckus about it, and it became violent. All right. Well, the only way they could put down this violent rebellion was they had to ask George Washington to reassemble his army and go to western Massachusetts and put it down. Okay? So the Articles of Confederation ultimately, in the end, failed because they weren't strong enough to enable the country to exist as one entity. They couldn't raise taxes. They couldn't make trade agreements. They couldn't act together through a central government. So because of all of these failures and all of this stuff going on, in 1787, they decide to have a constitutional convention. All right. Once again, just like the Continental Convention, which was assembled to decide whether or not to declare independence, delegates from each colony were sent to Philadelphia to hammer out a constitution. Okay? Who was put in charge of this assembly? Who do you think was the one guy that everybody looked up to so much that one glance from him would shut you up?
George Washington.
George Washington. Yeah. Okay. So he said almost nothing. He didn't engage in the debates. He just, using, I suppose, a version of Robert's Rules of Order, he just ran the convention. Okay? All right. Now, with respect to slavery, they had to deal with the slavery issue. And here's why. They had to deal with the slavery issue because the southern colonies said if you do away with slavery, and many people at the time wanted to do away with slavery, although there was this idea that many of the founders had that slavery would eventually just go away of its own accord because it wasn't practiced any place anymore. This was the only place where it was practiced. Slavery was out of date. Okay, people didn't do it anymore. All right. However, the southern colonies said, we will not enter any kind of union with the northern colonies unless we are guaranteed to keep our slaves. How did the Constitution deal with that?
There was a percentage. I don't know what the percentage was, but.
Okay. Here's the way it worked. Okay, there's two issues here. All right. Number one, representation in the national legislature, okay, any future national legislature would be based on the population of the state. So, which state has the most people in the House of Representatives? Today, California.
It used to be New York.
Why do we have more than North Dakota? Because we have more people. That's right.
Plain and simple.
Yeah. Okay, now in the South, the number of whites was very low. All right? And in the North, it was all white. Okay, so the southern colonies were concerned not only to hold on to their slaves, they were concerned that they would have so many fewer people in the national legislature that the northern colonies would have all the power. Yeah. Okay, so the Constitution, so the compromise was this. Slavery would be allowed, all right, because a slave was defined as property. And in order to mollify the Southerners, one slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person. All right, so if you have 100 slaves and they're each 3/5 of a person, and then you've got one white family, now you've got more representatives. You see what I'm saying? Okay. That was why Abraham Lincoln, when the Civil War broke out, many people don't understand this. Abraham Lincoln said, I have no authority to do away with slavery. And he didn't, because it's legal in the Constitution. So do you know what Abraham Lincoln used in order to eventually get rid of slavery?
The Emancipation Proclamation.
Yeah, he wrote that,
Yeah.
but what was it based on? Since it couldn't be based on the Constitution, what was it based on? It was based on what Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, that all people are created equal. That's why he quoted that in the Gettysburg Address. Okay? So that's how he was able to... now, the Emancipation Proclamation, this was also an extremely wise political move on his part. Okay? So the idea was this. If the Southerners are going to define their slaves as property, then during a war, when there is a war going on, the adversaries can take the property that helps their adversary fight the war, they can take it. And that's what the Emancipation Proclamation is based on. It was a political document, all right? He freed all the slaves because the slaves made the South stronger to fight the war. That's how he justified that. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, I want to go back real quickly before we're done. I should have put page numbers on this. But I want to talk a little bit about the difference between Calvinism and Lutheranism. Because Calvinism had the biggest effect on American culture. All right. Okay, here's one of the main differences between Luther and Calvin. Okay, both of them believed, rightly, that when you read the Bible, you're reading either something that is categorized as a law or something that is categorized as gospel. Okay? So the Ten Commandments would be law. God telling people what to do would be law. The prophets condemning the rich would be law. Okay? So there's law and there's gospel in the Bible. Gospel is all the messages in the Bible about God's mercy and forgiveness and redemption. How God ultimately is going to redeem humankind from sin and death. All right, now, why is there, what is the function of the law in the Bible? Why do we have the law in the Bible?
Convict us of our sin.
Exactly. It's like holding up a mirror. All right? If you're a person who has a skin disease and you hold up a mirror, are you going to want to look in the mirror? No, you're not going to want to because you don't like what you see. Right? Okay? So the law, the function of the law is for us to be able to become aware of the fact that in the eyes of God, we don't live as we should. Okay, we're sinners. Okay, and the function of the gospel. Okay, so the law doesn't just convict us of our sin by showing us how we disobey God, but the law also then drives us to the gospel. Because the gospel tells us that we're forgiven and that we have God's mercy and ultimately God's redemption. Okay? So the function of the law is to convict us of sin. The function of the gospel is to create faith in God's promises of forgiveness and love and redemption. Okay? That's Lutheranism in a nutshell. Calvin had what he called the third use of the law. Okay? For Luther, there was two uses. Number one, it convicted you of your sin. Number two, it drove you to the gospel. Calvin said, yeah, but there's a third use for the law. And that is that it's a guide for life. It gives us a guide for how to live our lives. All right? So it enables us to better see how God wants us to live. All right? So, if you're in a culture that believes that that God created us equal that we are free, what is that third use of the law going to cause people to do? In other words, if the government, if you believe that the government should not have any power over your conscience, okay, and remember, charity is a matter of conscience, right? Good works is a matter of conscience. Helping your neighbor is a matter of conscience. Loving your neighbor is a matter of conscience, all right? If you believe that the government should stay out of that because human beings were given freedom to either live as God revealed or not. It's our choice. Okay? So if the government is to stay out of the business of helping, people in dire situations, who's responsible for that?
People.
The people are responsible. Yeah. In a free society, the people are responsible. Okay, so how does that actually work? Okay, how it worked in early American life. There were no food stamps or welfare or anything like that in early America because they believed that if the government forced people to do charitable works, was it really charitable if you were forced to do it? No. No, because you aren't freely choosing to do it, all right? So they believe that the government should not get involved in that. These are matters that pertain to the family and the church, okay? So when it came to helping people in need, that was up to people living their Christian life. Hopefully there's family, and in a lot of cases there wasn't, but if there was, they were responsible. And number two, the church. The church was responsible. Okay. And over time, what developed in America that didn't develop so much in other countries? Because the government wasn't, until LBJ came along with his great society, what developed in America that didn't develop so much in other countries?
Organizations.
Non-profit organizations. Yeah, non-profits. Non-profits are charitable organizations, but they're non-governmental. Right? You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
Food banks, things like that. They started here because the government was not involved in it. In Europe, early on in the 19th century, in Europe, they developed social welfare states. So in the end, and I'll finish with this, and we'll get to the Constitutional Convention next week. I'll finish with this. In the end, if you emphasize that people are by nature, or I should say, people are endowed with freedom by their Creator. And the government is not allowed to interfere with that freedom. Okay? You open up tons of possibilities. That's the advantage of that. The advantage of the way things operate in Western Europe, where everything is run by the government, the advantage there is that nobody falls through the cracks. Everybody's covered. Okay, I didn't get through everything I wrote in here, so you can read it as you please, and next week we'll talk about how the Constitution was written and why it was written the way it was. Thanks for joining us, Jerry.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.